Thank you. It is actually very, very good to be here on this long weekend. I'm genuinely pretty stoked at how many people are actually here. I gotta say, I actually am a worship pastor and associate pastor at a church up the escarpment or mountain if you're from Hamilton, even though it's not a mountain. And we had probably just about the same amount of people, but it looked less full because our room's a little bit bigger. So well done on you guys. We really love coming down to Lift. Me and my wife Emily sitting right in the front row there. This really is like a home away from home for us. We just feel right at home with you guys. You guys are so awesome and welcoming. So thanks for always being here. That's all I'm saying. But we're going to jump into the Word. So if you have your Bible or if you want to pick up the Bible beside you on your seat, you can track along with me. We're going to do a bit of reading tonight. We're going to get into Romans chapter 12. Romans chapter 12. Now, I realize that we're talking about ancient practices, and the book of Romans is New Testament, so it's only 2,000 years old, so I know that doesn't seem that long ago. If you think about it, it is, but that's going to be our point of reference, but we are going to be digging back in. We are in our second week, as Robin was saying, of this series. Really excited to be talking to you guys about worship. As Robin said, this is a very passionate subject for me. Obviously, it's part of the reason why I'm employed somewhere. I did go to school for it at Hillsong College in Australia and studied that for 3 years. So now I realize how little I actually know about worship. So hopefully that doesn't shake your confidence in what I'm about to tell you. Trust me, it's going to be okay. It's going to be fine. But really, we're really looking at these things, this concept of worship in the Old Testament, the ancient practices of worship, and trying to understand what it means for us today. Sometimes we have a tendency to look at what they did as worship in the Old Testament and be like, well, that doesn't apply to me at all, and we just move on. But really, I think that there's tremendous value in looking at what worship for the Israelites, for the people of God in the Old Testament, the people we read about in the Bible actually was, because I think it's incredibly valuable and actually has very applicable things for us to be looking at. So, are you there? Romans chapter 12? All right, we're going to read. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. For by grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith God has assigned. For as in one body we have many members, and the members do not all have the same function. So we, though many, are one in the body of Christ, and individually members one of another. Having gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, let us use them. If prophecy, in proportion to our faith; if service, in serving; the one who teaches in his teaching; the one who exhorts in his exhortation; the one who contributes in generosity; the one who leads with zeal; and the one who acts of mercy with cheerfulness. And we're going to keep going. Let love be genuine. Abhor what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Love one another with brotherly affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Do not be slothful in zeal. Be fervent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in tribulation. Be constant in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints, that is us, the body, the church, and this community, and seek to show hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep, live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own sight. Repay no one for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For by doing so, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Come on, let's pray. Father, I thank you so much for your word. I thank you that it is living and active and that every time we open it, you speak. And so, Father, I just pray that tonight as I bring the word, that you would speak through me, that it would be your words that take root in people's hearts and that my words would just fall to the floor and be forgotten. And we pray this in your name, amen. Typically, I pray for the Blue Jays there, but let's face it, they're beyond prayer. It's something, not that God can't do it. I just think that he looks at them and goes, nah, not worth it. So, all right. Well, there's something you need to know about me. I have skills in certain areas. I can play music. I can do a little bit of graphic design. And I can do some things. But one thing that I'm genuinely unskilled at is giving gifts. I am terrible at it. Now, when I say this, what happens is that I get so in my own head, I get so stressed out that I'll actually walk into stores and be like, that would be perfect for that person. Then I go, but what if this? Like, what if they don't like the color green? I mean, sure, they want this flower vase, but what if they don't like the color green? So then maybe I need to find a yellow one, but then I'm like, well, what if they don't like rectangles? What if they want a triangle? And then I just get so in my own head that at the end of the day, I'm like, I got you a gift card. So happy birthday, or I forgot because it was 3 weeks ago. But when I do happen to remember someone's birthday, when I do happen to remember that it's Christmas, when I do actually happen to remember that I need to get someone a gift, I really just defer to my wife. I'm like, Emily, hey, what should we get this person? She's like, what if we got them this, something from Indigo, because it's always good at Indigo, and it's always right, and they're always happy. But me, when I was a kid, especially when I was a kid as a young child, I'm trying to get over my lack of gift-giving ability. I would actually, I would go to the mall with my allowance, and when I actually had money to give someone a Christmas gift or a birthday present, and I would just go in and panic. And you know how it is when you're a kid, you're like 8 or 9 years old or whatever, and so you give everyone their Christmas presents, and your parents are opening them, and they're like, oh, coaster, that's lovely, thank you. And you're like, no worries. But then like 6 years later, you're like, that's a terrible gift. No one wants a coaster. I ended up giving my mom a clay train one year, and she was like, thank you, that's so great, and gave me a hug, because they're my parents, right? Like, they see that I'm like, hey, I spent my allowance on you, and all I could afford was a coaster, so here you go. Maybe give me a raise, but, whatever. It's all good. So, but then I realized this concept that if I gave a gift to my parents, despite the fact that it wasn't a very good gift, if I was genuine in trying to give them something out of the goodness of my heart, they were actually really appreciative. They'd give me a hug. They genuinely used it. They'd use the coaster I gave them, and they put the little clay train up on the shelf. And so I was like, you know what? I could exploit this to my own good. I'll get them stuff that I want, and then I'll just use it. So you end up like, like, Merry Christmas, Mom. And she's like, oh, The Matrix on VHS in widescreen. And I'm like, oh, if you don't want it, I'll just take it, 15 years old, I can watch it, it's no big deal. Or, I give my dad like a CD, and he's like, oh, POD, that's, thanks. And I'm like, if you don't want it, yeah, I'll just take it. Yeah, it's fine. I think I took it the same day that I gave it to him. I don't think he ever listened to it even once. But genuinely, this was my mindset when it came to gift giving. And, I actually think that in a lot of ways, we can do this when it comes to worship. We can treat worship in a similar fashion. Now, something that we need to understand is that in our modern day context of worship, when I say worship, what jumps into your head? I mean, probably the majority of people in this room are going to think about a time of music that we all get together as a church and we sing some songs and like we raise our hands a little bit if it's like we're really feeling it, and like maybe if it's really fast we clap along, and if you're really really getting into it, you'll do one of these where you're not jumping, but you're like just bobbing your ankles so it looks like you're jumping to the people behind you, and you're like, I'm looking charismatic this morning. Hey, what's up? But so we have this like picture of worship that is like this 20-minute moment in a service, and instantly we kind of go to this idea of that's our time to receive. That's our time to encounter. When I stand in worship, I have this great experience where it's so refreshing and it's so nice. And it's not that isn't worship, but it's not that that's all of worship either. And this morning, what time is it? Jeez. Tonight, I want to challenge that mindset of worship, because it's not that I think that that's a destructive mindset of worship necessarily, but what I think it is it's like 1% of what worship actually is. Worship is actually so expansive, so broad, and so important for our lives as Christians in our relationship with God that if we reduce it to a 20-minute service, we're actually gypping ourselves. We're actually robbing ourselves of so much of what God has for us. So in order to understand the context of worship today and the proper context, we need to look outside of our immediate context to see where we've been, which is why we're doing this ancient practice of worship. So as I said, or I'll just tell you right now, Robin said last week that there is going to be a bit of jumping around to different sections of the Bible because since this is such a broad topic and worship in general has started since the beginning of the Bible and it runs all the way to the end of the Bible, it is everywhere in there. So our key verse is going to be Romans 12, and if that's a little confusing as to why that's the key verse, don't worry, I'm going to come around to it. But we're just going to be jumping through some different stories in the Bible. So in Genesis chapter 4, this is probably one of the first displays of worship in an act that we actually see, which is an interesting place to be jumping because this early in Genesis, there's no instruments, there's no microphones, there's no sound systems or lights or anything like that. There's just people in loincloths, and that's what's going on. So you have Cain and you have Abel. These two brothers, they are the sons of Adam and Eve have raised them in a relationship with God. We actually read in Genesis chapter 4 that when Cain and Abel bring these offerings to God, God actually interacts with him. If you're looking at it, you can actually see that God is actually communicating with them. So there's actually this relationship where humanity, Cain and Abel, are actually conversing and having a relationship with God. But one of the things that they're actually bringing is sacrifice. Now, Abel brings this sacrifice. It's like he's watching the sheep. So he brings, like some mutton chop. He brings some like actual lamb, and he's like, oh yeah, we're going to get this up here. God, this is for you. I'm just going to give you this. And God looks at that offering and he's like, man, that's awesome. He looks at it favorably. And then Cain, his brother, brings him a bunch of fruit. And he brings him this offering, and God doesn't look at it favorably. And we have a tendency to look at that story and go, well, that's because he brought fruit. Hello, God is a meat eater. He wants some spadooch. That's what's going on there. But that's not actually what's happening. See, what's happening is that God is perceiving the level of giving in the person's heart. See, it's sacrificial. The gift that Abel brings is a sacrificial gift that he brings before God. In response to who God is, he says, I'm going to give you this because you deserve it. God, you actually deserve so much more, but this is what I'm going to give you this. It's my first, it's my best. And Cain actually just goes, I'm just going to give you some fruit. It's not like my best, it's not my first, but I'll just give you some because it's, I'm giving you something. And he's just kind of going through the motions, the religious motions of that. And then we actually see this really horrible encounter where Cain actually kills his brother out of jealousy, which just shows and contrasts the broken relationship of humanity with God. But this whole idea of bringing a sacrifice, bringing an offering, kind of continues throughout the book of Genesis. We see it with different families, different key characters, that they actually take animals and they actually give offerings to God. Typically, they'll go up on a mountain or a high place, and then they make a burnt offering to God. Noah does it when he gets out of the ark. And then eventually, we just run into this guy named Abraham. Abraham also has an encounter with God where he's speaking with him, and God says, I'm going to choose you. I'm going to make your nation great. I'm going to give you, and he's like, I don't even have a son. He's like, I'll take care of that. Don't worry about it. First, I need you to circumcise yourself, though. And Abraham's like, yeah, all right, I'll do it. Which, I mean, don't get me wrong. If God calls you to do something, you're going to do it. But this is sacrificial, painful sacrificial. I mean, he is a fully grown old adult. Things do not heal properly when you're that old. So it is actually sacrificial. It will be a permanent thing. It won't heal properly. But what it is it's him going, okay, you asked me to do this, I'm going to do it. It's going to be a symbol of the covenant that we've made. And Abraham also does this similar burnt sacrifice thing where he actually cuts some animals in half. It's very strange, but Robin talked about sacrifice a couple weeks ago, so just reference that podcast if you want to know more about why we murdered animals back in the day. Check it out. It is a very good podcast. And this kind of continues, and then it ends up running into Isaac. Abraham and Sarah, his wife, have a baby, even though they're way past their years. And then almost immediately afterwards, God's like, okay, I want you to go and take your son. And he's like, yeah. He's like, I want you to go up on a mountain. He's like, yeah. And then I want you to do a sacrifice. And he's like, yeah. And then he's like, and it's your son. And he's like, okay, I'll do it. Which is crazy. I mean, they've been waiting for a son for almost 100 years. Now, you need to understand something in the context. It was shameful for women to be barren. It is shameful for women to be barren back in this Jewish context. So they've had shame for almost 100 years, and then they have this son, and it's this huge answer to prayer, and God's like, now go kill him. And you're like, what? What? But Abraham's like, yeah, okay, I'll do it. And so he walks him up this mountain, and then he even tells him before he puts him on the thing. He's like, all right, you're the sacrifice. Here we go. Get on the pyre. We're going to tie you on. And Isaac, I don't know what's going on. Apparently, like, Isaac would not have been the little boy that we think he was. He wasn't like 7 years old. He probably could have tried to fight back, but he just goes with it. He's like, all right. He just lies down on this altar. He's like, well, but then God intervenes and says, no, I just wanted to see if you would do it. Obviously, you will. Your heart is good. Your heart is for me. You're obedient. You're a man after my own heart. You know what? Take your son down. I'm going to give you another sacrifice, which represents Christ, by the way. And there's a ram in the bushes. And very cool. He doesn't need to kill his son. Awesome. And this sort of family sacrificial system sort of continues. But then it leads all the way up to the time when the Israelites are in Egypt. They're in captivity. It's very awful. And then this cat named Moses ends up kind of being a bit of a brat, kills someone, runs away. Out in the desert, encounters God. God speaks to him. He comes back. God, through him, delivers the Israelites. They perform a bunch of miracles. Pharaoh eventually is like, get out of my country because you're awful. You're like ruining my life. And then he changes his mind. He's like, I'm going to come after you and kill you while you're leaving. And then God splits the Red Sea. They walk through the Red Sea. And on the other side, God closes it, takes out the Egyptians. They're totally free. And on the other side of this, the Israelites have this response where they just break out into song. Like they just totally break out into dancing and clapping, and they're playing instruments that they have, and they're singing to God, they're raising their hands, and they're having this moment of worship. And this is really one of the first times that we see this huge congregational setting type worship that's going on. And then we all know, or some of you may not know, I'm going to tell you, Moses goes up on Mount Sinai and gets these things called the 10 Commandments. And when he comes down, he tells the people, he says, this is what we need to do to be in relationship with God. And the first commandment is in Exodus 20. It says, and God spoke all these words saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord, your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. And it continues to go on and give the 10 commandments. But I just wanted to pause there because it's interesting that the first commandment that God gives is, I am the Lord your God. You have no other God before me. Now, you need to understand the Israelites came out of Egypt. Egypt would have been a very polytheistic kind of place. There was multiple gods. There was multiple ceremonies. They did sacrifice. They did songs. They did strange, different things in order to worship these false gods. So they're coming out, and they've embraced this idea that you can have multiple gods. You don't need to just have one God. You can have multiple gods. So they're coming out, and they're like, well, that's awesome because we got this God, and then we have all those other gods to back up on just in case. And God's like, no, I am the Lord your God. There's no other. You will not bow down to any other gods. And the people actually say, yeah, we'll do this. Don't leave us, God. We'll go with you. We're following you. We will do what you've asked us to do. And then we, coming out of that place, there's also, God gives a whole bunch of instructions for the priests. He gives a whole bunch of instructions for how they're going to build the tabernacle, which is this tent where God's presence would actually come. It's essentially in the time, it would have been kind of like the church of the time. So all the priests were there. They have like all these special garments that they need to make out of special fabric and cut a specific way. And they have to have like this breastplate with like all these stones on it. And they have all these bowls made out of certain metal. And they have like this giant tent that is essentially like, it needs to be all measured out perfectly and made a certain way. And it's just a lot of pomp and circumstance in order to build this tabernacle. It's very specific, but they do it because they were asked to do it. They go along with it. And the thing that you need to realize is that the presence of God back then would have been in the tabernacle. So for them, they were making the house of the Lord in this tent, and they were going to do whatever it took to keep the presence of God with them. See, they didn't want the presence of God to go anywhere else. They were like, no, we'll do whatever you want. We'll wash our hands in copper bowls that are hammered, or, we'll wear non-mixed fabric, and I'll wear a breastplate, and we'll use precious metals that we could put to something else, but we're going to put it to this because we want to give it to you. We want your presence. We want to encounter you. And this continues on through the days of Joshua until eventually the Israelites make it to the promised land, and then they build a temple. And this temple is where the presence of God finally rests. There's no need for the tabernacle. There's no need for a wandering tent. Also in there is the ark of the covenant, which they had out in the desert, which they carried and kept in the tabernacle. Then they brought that into the temple. And so the temple was the place where God's presence would have been. It was the place where if you wanted to encounter God, you would go worship there. Now, we need to understand something before we go any further about the word worship. In the English language, we have one word, it's worship. But in the Hebrew and Greek language, there are multiple words that are used for all of the different places that we put worship. There is praise, there is consecration, there is in obedience to. There's a whole bunch of different meanings when we're actually thinking about worship. And the challenge for us is that when we think about worship, we only think about it in one way. But really, if we look back on all these different things that used to happen in the Old Testament, whether it's bringing animals to sacrifice and burn, or whether it's lifting your hands and actually singing praise, or whether it's washing yourself ceremonially and building a tent and wearing the right clothes and saying the right things and following a religious protocol and following the commandments, whatever it is, that was considered worship. That would have been considered worship. And then we're in a danger of negating the importance of so many aspects of worship if all that we think is it's 20 minutes. If you do the math, 20 minutes in a whole year, every week, is anyone 52 times 20? Any engineers who could do mental math? Sorry? 1,040? I don't know. 1,040 minutes in the grand scheme of a year, which has how many minutes? 522,600 minutes. Is that right? I'm just quoting Rent. I don't even know at this point, guys. Sure, it's not a lot. And so the problem is that the Israelites and the people of old in these ancient practices viewed worship as this holistic, completely all-consuming, every single day way of life. We view it as a 20-minute service. They viewed it as an everyday way of life. And sure, there's different aspects to that. Sure, there's the time where you go and burn an animal, and there's the time that you go and sing songs, and there's the time that you need to ceremonially do things. But life in general, living in community in general, was actually all considered worship. But the interesting thing that we need to notice is that every time that there's, in every single one of these stories, that there's any action taken, it's always a response to God. It's always a response to God that always comes out of a heart for God. So I don't know if you're taking any notes, but if you are, my first point is worship is a physical response driven by a posture of the heart. When I started giving Christmas gifts to my family, like I said, they were very terrible. Nobody wants a coaster. Just for future reference, if you're buying Christmas gifts this year, do not buy people coasters. They're not good gifts. If I could go back in time, I would tell my 7-year-old self, don't do that. It's stupid. It's not a good gift. But the fact that my dad thanked me and took it graciously and gave me a hug and embraced me and still uses it to this day doesn't speak to the quality of the gift. I know, quality. Whatever, leave it alone. Doesn't speak to the quality of the gift. It actually speaks to his character. It speaks more to the character of my father that he was happy about getting a coaster and that he actually used it and that he was appreciative of it than the fact that it was a coaster. Because trust me, it's not like it was like some well, this is actually a platinum plated coaster. It's like, it was probably plastic and $3. So it's not like, oh, Merry Christmas. By the way, where's my hockey net? You know, like, it was not a very good gift at all. But the fact that he enjoyed it, the fact that he used it, the fact that he embraced me for it and was appreciative for it, speaks more to his character than the quality of the gift. And this is what we see throughout the stories of the Bible. People, out of their love and their respect and their honor for God, respond in a physical manner. They respond in a physical way, whether it be burning an animal, lifting their hands, singing a song, wearing certain garments, or making a huge temple. Whatever kind of act of worship it was back in the Old Testament, it was always motivated and driven by a love for God, a desire for God, and it was all about giving him honor and glory and respect. Like Abel, you know, I mean, you just picture what's going on in his head where he's like looking at this cute little lamb frolicking in a field, and he's like, I bet God would love that if I killed it and burned it. You're like, what? And we don't know if Adam and Eve were like, oh, that's what you got to do. We don't actually know. But either way, he was willing to take this cute little lamb and just end its life and burn it for God. And like, maybe I'm not God, but if I was, I'd be like, well, that's a weird gift. But I like your heart, buddy. I like where it's at. It's the same thing. It's the same thing as my dad going, thanks for the coaster, son. Like, it's the exact same thing with God. He's our Father, and he loves when we bring him gifts. He loves when we bring him praise. He loves when we bring him worship. I got to be really honest with you. It's kind of strange. Abraham circumcising himself, that's a strange thing. But God was like, thank you for being obedient. Abraham cutting animals in half, strange thing. But God's like, thank you for being obedient. Abraham almost sacrificing his son, same thing. Thank you for being obedient. Here's a ram. All of the times that the Israelites have this way of worshiping God, of praising him, of lifting him up, of glorifying him, of bringing him honor, it's like God is sitting up there going, I love where your heart's at. And see, we sort of say that as an insult. You know what I'm saying? Like, oh, you got a good heart. But really what you're saying is, what are you doing? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, when there's that person serving on your team and they're like, yeah, but, you know, they got a great heart. And it's like, that pretty much is like, they're not good at their job. Like, that's what it means. But when God says that about us, he's like, you just have a good heart. I love the posture of your heart. And worship always gets its start in our heart out of a posture of worship. What am I saying when I say a posture? It's all those different things that I was talking about, those different facets in the original language, whether it be praise, whether it be consecrating ourselves before God, getting down on our face and just being blown away by him, whether it be obedience, whether it be respect, whether it be whatever it is, that posture in our heart that's saying, God, I'm doing this for you because I love you, because I honor you, because I want to glorify you. You know, if we're being really, really, really honest, I don't think God cares as much about the gift as he does about the heart. Like, there's not a whole lot that a dying sheep does for God. And I mean, I'm sure that you guys are great singers, but I really don't think that God's sitting up there going, man, you nailed that note. That is awesome. I'm giving you a little extra Holy Spirit right now. Like, that's not what's going on when you're singing. That's not what's going on when we praise. That's not what's going on when we worship. When we give a gift to God, when we worship God, it's not like he's super impressed with what we're giving him. I'm a worship leader. I'm pretty sure God's not like, wow, man, you just play those wrong chords really well. They almost sound like they fit. You know, like it's not like that. It's like God sitting up there going, I see where your heart's at. It's like a loving father who is looking at our hearts and going, I see where your heart's at. Now, this often gets used as an excuse, though, because we're like, well, my heart is in a place of worship, so I'm just going to sit down and cross my arms and close my eyes. And you're like, okay, well, no. First of all, we need to understand, Worship is, and this is a definition that I heard a couple years ago and it's always stuck with me. I think it's the best definition of worship I've ever heard in my life. It's by a guy named Louis Giglio. Worship is our response to God for who he is and what he's done, expressed in and by the things that we say and do. Worship is our response to God for who he is and what he has done, expressed in and by the things that we say and we do. It's a response. It's an action. And sometimes that action is causing yourself to go, I just need to sit still right now. I'm just gonna have some self-discipline, just sit still and just sit in the presence of God. But for the most part, if you're sitting there going, well, I just don't engage in worship that way, I would just encourage you, question the posture of your heart. Where's the posture of your heart at? Because really, we're not lifting our hands in worship just to receive. We're actually worshiping to give. Does that make sense? You guys tracking? Turn to your neighbors and say, those pants are actually really tight. When it gets hot up here, man, you feel it. What is going on here? Oh, man. But here's the thing. Anything that we do to draw closer to God is worship. When we need to deal with sin in our life, that's worship. Coming to God and being like, this is what's up. God, I'm messed up in this area and I need your help is worship. Back in the Old Testament, the reason that it was worship that they would go and make an animal sacrifice was because they were realigning themselves with God. Worship is relationship. Whatever we do to draw closer to God in a relationship is in essence worship. Whatever action we take to respond to God for who he is and what he has done is worship. So what that means is you could be standing in this room, you could be lifting your hands in worship, but if you're not actually genuinely there, if you're not actually genuinely responding to God and you're just kind of going through the motions and you're just kind of doing it, then you're really being kind of like Cain. Yo, I'll bring this. Yeah, that'll do. And God looked at it not favorably. But we need to be the Abel who's like, man, I'm just gonna come with my all. See, the thing is, there's so much to worship God for. And if you're in this place and you're like, man, I just don't know why, I just don't really like worship, I just don't engage, I don't think you have trouble being a worshiper. I think you have trouble with the revelation of Jesus. Because if we really understood what Jesus did for us on the cross, if we really understood the creative power of our God who made all of the heavens and all of the earth, everything that we look at in nature, if we truly understand how massively powerful and amazing and magnificent our God is, it's super hard to be like, man, what have you done for me lately? And if we really understand how far our deficit between us and God was before Jesus came, but that he came and for free was like, I love you so much, I'm going to rescue you. If we really understand that, we will be worshipers. I'm just saying. But if we have trouble entering in, it's probably because we don't fully grasp what God has done for us. So we got to go after it. We got to get that. The more that we get revelation of Jesus, the more that we will worship. And anytime that we do anything to draw closer to God, that is worship. Digging into your word, that is worship. Do you see what I'm getting at here? See, we live in a culture where it's 20 minutes of worship, right? I understand that, but it's going to take, if we want to reach this campus and the surrounding community, if we want to see families come in here and we want to see people radically encounter God and see lives changed forever and see our city changed, can you imagine how good it would be when Hamilton's not doesn't have the second most impoverished neighborhood in Canada in it? Because we just went out and we're the hands and feet of Christ. I mean, that's worship, guys, but that's more than 20 minutes. We will never change anything through 20 minutes of worship if it doesn't translate into our week. If we don't wake up in the morning and get our hearts into a posture of thanksgiving and praise and supplication or submission to God, if we're not waking up every morning and going, God, I'm doing everything I'm doing today for you, then it's just not going to translate. And this is bigger than us. It's bigger than us. So this brings me to my second point. Worship is about God. 8:30, right? I forgot to start my timer, so I'm a little bit all over. Yeah. Worship is about God. It's not about you. I know that sounds kind of harsh. I know that some of you are probably sitting there going, ooh, ouch. That's kind of, but remember, we're in like this super generation, iPad, iPod, iTunes, iWork, like everything that we have is centered around us. And actually so much to the point that when you find out something's not about you, you're kind of like, I don't really like that. Like genuinely, like, and it doesn't even need to apply to you, but like when you walk in somewhere and like one of the people behind the counter is busy helping someone else and they're taking a little too long and you're like, what am I going to get helped here? Do you know who I am? And it's like, well, actually, it's not about you. You're like, well, I'm never coming to this Harvey's again. Like, you know, but genuinely, I'm not saying this to be edgy. I'm saying this because it's the same thing about me giving the Matrix to my mom. She does not care. All right? It is not her deal. She does, and so it's self-serving for me to be like, hey, here, I got you a movie that I want, and Dad, I got you a CD that I want. You don't want them? Okay, I'll take them back. So when we come into a place of worship and we're like, God, impact me. That's not actually worship. That's receiving, and that's important. Don't get me wrong. If we want to be a community that's going to reach people, we need to be receiving. That's not what I'm saying. But that is not the intention and heart of worship. When we come into worship, it's all about God. It is all about God. 100% the reason that we worship is to bring Him honor and glory and praise. So when you come into, and sometimes it's kind of like we do this thing where it's like, well, God, I didn't really even want to be here tonight, and it's a long weekend. And when I came in, I kind of clapped through the first song about halfway, and then I didn't sit down, and I raised my hands for a third of it, so your turn. Give me some, impact me, do your thing. But it's not a tally, and it's not a competition. And thank God for that. Because if it was a tally, we're still trying to catch up to the creation of the universe, and we're never going to catch up to the cross. God does not owe us a thing. We owe Him everything. And I'm not saying that to demean anyone in this room. The crazy thing about God is that He doesn't owe us anything, and yet He gave everything. I mean, that's crazy. He has no need. He has no need to come into this room and be worshipped by you in the sense, He doesn't need power from you. It's not like us worshiping Him. He's like, oh, I'm building up my power. That's not the way it works. God's perfect. He doesn't need it. He's not insecure. He doesn't need you to tell Him who He is. He's not like, am I amazing, guys? Tell me. And you're like, God, you're amazing. Thanks, guys. That's amazing. We don't sing worship songs to affirm God. He's not sitting up there going, I don't know who I am. We sing worship songs to align ourselves to Him. We sing worship songs to remind ourselves of who He is. When we sing Beautiful Exchange, it's not like God's going, did I do that? Oh, that is a beautiful exchange. It's so that we sit here and go, flip. Man, you were near, and I was distant. I was lost. I was confused. I was insecure. But God, you came and rescued me. It's all about Him. It's not about us. I mean, can you imagine how crazy it would be if when I gave someone a Christmas present, I was like, here you go, where's mine? They'd be like, oh, it's okay, I don't want your present. Like, I'd actually say that. If someone was like, here's your Christmas present, where's mine? I'd be like, go away. Like, here, you keep it. Whatever it is, clearly all you want is whatever it is. But like, really, we're not supposed to be coming into this place and just going, God, I need spiritual fireworks in my life. It's not about that. It's about giving God praise. And what that actually does for us is super valuable. See, this is the and portion. The more that we make it about God, the more that it benefits us. Total paradox. So if you really want to be benefited by worship, you need to totally lose any motivation for yourself. You need to come into this place and just go, God, I'm going to give my all to you. And I challenge you, if you do that, man, you're going to be blown away by how much God just absolutely does something in your life. I fully believe that. And I fully believe it for this community. Like, guys, if we get this, if we make it all about God in our lives, it's just going to completely take it to another level. Because God is faithful to fill when you're asking Him to fill. But when you're pouring yourself out, it's like He just puts a fire hose on you. Because He sees that He's like, oh, you need this really badly. As opposed to, all right, but really, like, try giving a little bit out. But worship is all about God. It is all about God. And the last thing, and if I get the team to come up, is that we're made to worship. It's in our DNA. And The thing is that every single human being on this planet has been made to worship. It's part of our creation. It's part of our DNA. It's part of who we are intrinsically. And the reality is that because of the fall of man, the fall of Adam and Eve, where they rebelled against God and they actually got kicked out of the garden, there was broken relationship. That means that the purpose for worship has been lost. So you don't need to worship God. You can worship a whole bunch of other stuff, which is devastating because that's what we do, even as Christians. I mean, it doesn't take long to look around our generation. It doesn't take long to look around our society and see that people are living their lives worshiping themselves. See, because if you really take stock and you think, where's all of my effort, all of my time, all of my money, all of my affection, where's that all going? If you follow the trail, there's something sitting on the throne. And I got to be honest, so often in my life when I follow that trail, I'm like, oops, I put myself back on the throne. But Jesus belongs up there. Because worship's all about God. We need to have God completely consuming our hearts. When God is completely on our throne, it just changes everything. And we have this innate need to worship God. And when the kings of Israel would take over from the king before them, a lot of the time there was bad kings. And just bear with me for 5 more, not even 5 more minutes. But when they would take over, they would actually go through the kingdom and they rip down any idols. So they'd go to the high places that the previous kings before them had set up, to Baal, to Asherah, and they just rip down their idols. And we're just going to take a couple minutes here, and we're just going to actually, I want to challenge you guys. Think through, where is my time? Where's my effort? Where's my money? Where's my affection going? What's on the throne of my heart? And I would challenge you, if it's not God, there's no judgment. We've all been there. But man, it's going to devastate in the end. Everything is more beneficial when God is on the throne of our life. And if we really want to see our community reach, if we want to see our city reached, it's not going to happen when we're a bunch of 20-minute worshipers. It's going to happen when we're all the time worshipers. It says in Romans 12, the reason that I read this, Romans 12, is because that's the guidebook to what worship looks like. Read through that, the whole chapter, Romans 12. Lay down your lives as living sacrifices. This is your spiritual act of worship. It talks about how to treat one another. It talks about how to treat your enemies. It talks about how to use your gifts. Romans 12 is a roadmap to being a worshiper. So I just want to challenge you. I'm going to pray. But just take some time and just ask God, search your heart and see if there's anything else on that throne in your heart. So Father, I thank you so much for this group of people. I thank you so much for your word.